When we think of the golden age of retro gaming, our minds usually drift to the early 80s arcade boom or the mid-90s 3D revolution. But there is one specific year that acted as a massive, seismic bridge between the past and the future. The NES was dominating the living room, but bubbling just beneath the surface, the foundations of modern gaming were being poured. In this video, we're going back to 1988 to look at the hardware, the operating systems, the industry standards, and the games. In this first part, we are going to talk about the birth of a 16-bit legend, the quiet rise of Windows, a massive upgrade to MS-DOS, and the formation of an alliance that saved PC graphics from total chaos. Let's dive in. By late 1988, gamers were hungry for the next big thing. The 8-bit era was great, but arcades were still leagues ahead of home consoles in terms of graphics and sound. Sega decided it was time to bring the arcade into the living room. On October 29, 1988, Sega launched the Mega Drive in Japan. We'd later come to know it as the Genesis in North America. This wasn't just a minor upgrade, this was a technological beast. Sega built the Mega Drive around the Motorola 68000 processor. If that sounds familiar, it's because it was the exact same processor powering Sega's massive arcade cabinets at the time, like the System 16 board. So let's dive deeper. To truly understand the impact of the Sega Mega Drive, which would be famously rebranded as the Genesis in North America,
the Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do?
You have to look at the massive leap it represented over its predecessor, the Sega Master System. Designed by a hardware R&D team led by Masami Ishikawa and Hideki Sato, the Genesis was built from the ground up to solve a specific problem. Sega's Master System, despite being a highly capable 8-bit console, was getting absolutely crushed by the Nintendo Entertainment System in Japan and North America. Ishikawa and Sato knew they couldn't just build another standard console. They needed to bring the authentic, high-speed arcade experience straight into the living room. The key to this revolution was the architecture. The Master System ran on an 8-bit Zilog Z80 processor. It was great for the early to mid-1980s, but it struggled to handle massive, complex sprites and fast-scrolling backgrounds. The Genesis, however, was a true 16-bit powerhouse. At its heart was the Motorola 68000 CPU running at 7.6 MHz. This was a legendary piece of silicon, the exact same chip that powered high-end personal computers like the Amiga and the Apple Macintosh, as well as Sega's own successful System 16 arcade cabinets. By using this architecture, Sega made it incredibly easy for developers to port massive arcade hits directly to the home console with minimal compromises. The differences between the Master System and the Genesis were night and day. Visually, the Master System could only display 32 colors on screen simultaneously, from a palette of 64. The Genesis doubled that on-screen count to 64 colors from a much richer palette of 512, alongside significantly higher resolutions and the ability to display up to 80 sprites on screen at once without massive slowdowns. Then there was the audio. The Master System relied on a basic programmable sound generator, producing standard, relatively simple 8-bit bleeps and bloops. The Genesis introduced the Yamaha YM2612 FM synthesizer chip. This gave the console its legendary, gritty, metallic, bass-heavy sound, a driving force behind the iconic, fast-paced soundtracks of games like Sonic the Hedgehog and Streets of Rage. Interestingly, Sega didn't just throw the Master System's old Zilog Z80 chip out. They kept it inside the Genesis to act as a coprocessor for sound management. As a brilliant side effect, this meant the Genesis was actually perfectly backwards compatible with Master System games on a hardware level, which players could easily play using the Power Base Converter add-on. Beyond the silicon, the Genesis brought vital advancements to the physical gaming experience. It popularized the ergonomic, crescent-shaped controller with a dedicated start button and 3 action buttons. This was a massive, comfortable upgrade from the Master System's stiff, rectangular 2-button pad with a pause button awkwardly placed on the console itself. Later in its lifespan, the Genesis architecture allowed for what Sega famously marketed as blast processing. While it was heavily used as an aggressive marketing buzzword, it was based on real tech, the console's direct memory access controller, which could transfer graphics data to the video RAM incredibly fast. This allowed for the lightning-speed scrolling seen in Sonic games, a sense of momentum that rival consoles struggled to replicate without dropping frames. Ultimately, Ishikawa and Sato's 16-bit machine didn't just replace the Master System, it modernized hardware standards, broke Nintendo's absolute monopoly, and kicked off the fiercest, most entertaining console war in video game history.
Meanwhile, over in the PC space, things were looking a little blocky. PC gaming was mostly text-heavy or running strictly out of command lines. But in mid-1988, Microsoft released a crucial update, Windows 2.1. To fully grasp the monumental shift that Windows 2.0 and its crucial 1988 update, Windows 2.1, brought to the computing world, we first have to look at the environment they were born into. Since the early 1980s, MS-DOS was the undisputed dominant force in PC computing. However, DOS was strictly a command-line interface. Operating a computer meant staring at a blinking cursor on a black screen and memorizing rigid text commands just to open a file or format a disk. Furthermore, DOS was inherently single-tasking. If you were typing a document and needed to do a complex calculation, you had to save your work, completely close your word processor, launch a calculator program, write down the result, close the calculator, and reopen your document. Microsoft's first attempt to visually streamline this process, Windows 1.0 in 1985, was widely considered a clumsy failure. Heavily restricted by hardware limitations and a desire to avoid legal wrath from Apple, who had popularized the graphical user interface with the Macintosh, Windows 1.0 did not allow application windows to overlap. Instead, windows were tiled side by side. If you opened 3 programs, the screen automatically carved itself into small, cramped, unusable boxes. It was essentially just a graphical shell awkwardly sitting on top of DOS. Windows 2.0, released in late 1987, completely shattered those limitations. Its most defining feature was the introduction of overlapping windows. For the first time on a Microsoft platform, users could freely resize, move, and stack application windows on top of each other, creating the digital desktop spatial metaphor we still use today. Windows 2.0 also introduced desktop icons, standardized keyboard shortcuts like Alt-Tab for switching between programs, and changed the confusing Windows 1.0 terminology of iconize and zoom to the now universal minimize and maximize. It was such a dramatic leap forward in usability that it prompted Apple to file a massive copyright lawsuit against Microsoft, claiming they had stolen the Macintosh look and feel. But the true technological breakthrough arrived in mid-1988 with the release of Windows 2.1. Microsoft realized that PC hardware was evolving rapidly, so they split the operating system into 2 distinct hardware-optimized versions, Windows/286 and Windows/386. Windows/286 was designed to take advantage of the high memory area on Intel 8286 processors. By moving core Windows data into this previously untapped memory space, it freed up precious conventional memory, allowing larger, more complex programs to run without crashing. However, Windows 386 was the absolute game changer, and it represented a massive technological advantage over raw MS-DOS.
It tapped directly into the advanced architecture of Intel's new 80386 processor, specifically a hardware feature called Virtual 8086 mode. This allowed Windows 386 to create virtual machines inside the computer. For the very first time, a PC user could run multiple completely separate MS-DOS programs simultaneously, with each program running in its own dedicated overlapping graphical window. This was true preemptive multitasking. You could have a Minesweeper game in one window, a word processor open in another, and a clock ticking in the corner, all without the system grinding to a halt. By breaking the single tasking constraints of MS-DOS and ditching the cramped tiled interface of Windows 1.0, the Windows 2.x era transformed the IBM-compatible PC. It lured major software developers to the platform, serving as the very first graphical home for legendary applications like Microsoft Excel, Microsoft Word, and Aldus PageMaker. It proved that the future of computing was not typing syntax into a void, but rather a dynamic, visual, multitasking workspace.
But what about the graphics that computers ran at the time? IBM had introduced the VGA standard, which allowed for 640 by 480 resolution, or 320 by 200 with 256 colors. It was beautiful. The problem? IBM kept it proprietary. Other companies started making clone graphics cards with higher resolutions, but they all used completely different coding. If a game developer wanted to make a high-resolution game, they had to program it for a dozen different incompatible graphics cards. It was a nightmare. Enter VESA. In November 1988, NEC Home Electronics gathered 8 other display manufacturers and said, "We need a standard." Together, they formed the Video Electronics Standards Association, or VESA. Their very first mission was to create a unified standard for Super VGA, 800 by 600 resolution. By coming together in late 1988, VESA saved PC gaming from graphical fragmentation. They gave developers a single high-resolution target to aim for, which directly paved the way for the gorgeous, crisp SVGA PC games of the 1990s. One of those clone cards was a card from ATI. Released in 1988, the ATI VGA Wonder 16 was a monumental piece of hardware that perfectly showcased the rapid evolution of PC graphics during this pivotal year. As ATI's very first 16-bit ISA graphics card and its first true Super VGA-compatible display adapter, it was built around the brand-new ATI 18800 chipset. Available in 256 kilobyte or 512 kilobyte memory configurations, the VGA Wonder 16 was an absolute powerhouse for its time. If you shelled out for the 512 kilobyte model, it could push resolutions up to 800 by 600 in 256 colors, leaving IBM's standard proprietary VGA in the dust. ATI also heavily marketed its performance, claiming the card ran up to 800% faster than a standard IBM VGA card when plugged into a 16-bit slot. What made the VGA Wonder 16 truly special, however, was its sheer versatility. It featured hardware auto-sensing that could detect the connected monitor type and switch modes without requiring the user to fiddle with manual dip switch adjustments. It also offered flawless backward compatibility with EGA, CGA, MDA, and Hercules displays. As a brilliant bonus, the card included a built-in bus mouse port, saving users from having to buy and install a dedicated mouse expansion card, and it was even bundled with a Microsoft-compatible Logitech mouse. It was the ultimate premium graphical all-in-one upgrade for the late 1980s PC gamer. Let's start with a game that almost didn't exist, The original Mega Man, released in 1987, was not a massive commercial success. Capcom management only allowed a sequel to be made if the development team worked on it in their free time while fulfilling their other daily duties. Driven by sheer passion, Akira Kitamura, Keiji Inafune, and their team poured their hearts into the project. Released in December 1988 in Japan, Mega Man 2 didn't just save the franchise, it completely redefined the action platformer genre. It took everything the first game did and perfected it. The game increased the roster of robot masters from 6 to 8, famously using boss designs submitted by fans through a magazine contest. It introduced vital series-defining gameplay mechanics like the password system, which allowed players to finally save their progress, and the life-saving energy tanks. Furthermore, the level design was meticulously crafted, striking a flawless balance between challenging platforming and rewarding boss fights. We also cannot talk about Mega Man 2 without mentioning its legendary soundtrack, composed by Takashi Tataishi. The driving, energetic track for Dr. Wily's Castle Stage 1 remains one of the most iconic pieces of 8-bit chiptune music ever recorded. Ultimately, Mega Man 2 became the highest-selling game in the entire series and cemented the Blue Bomber as an absolute video game icon. Over in the arcades, and subsequently on the brand-new Sega Mega Drive, 1988 saw the release of a legendary muscle-bound beat-em-up, Altered Beast. Developed by Makoto Uchida, who would later go on to create the Golden Axe series, the game pulled heavy inspiration from Greek mythology. The premise was delightfully absurd and immediately iconic. Zeus resurrects a fallen centurion from the dead with the booming, digitized voice command, "Rise from your grave," tasking him with rescuing his daughter Athena from the demon god Neph. What truly set Altered Beast apart from other side-scrolling brawlers of the time was its central transformation mechanic. As players defeated glowing, two-headed wolves, they collected spirit balls that buffed their characters' muscles to ridiculous proportions. Collecting 3 spirit balls triggered a cinematic transformation into a tremendously powerful, screen-clearing creature such as a werewolf, a were-dragon, a were-bear, or a were-tiger. Visually, it was a massive flex of Sega's hardware capabilities. The character sprites were huge, detailed, and completely dwarfed anything available on the 8-bit NES. Because it perfectly demonstrated the raw graphical and audio power of the 16-bit era, Altered Beast was chosen as the original pack-in title for the Sega Genesis in North America, acting as the ultimate Trojan horse to get authentic arcade-quality gaming into the living room. While Sega was pushing raw 16-bit arcade power, Tecmo proved in December 1988 that the 8-bit NES still had massive, groundbreaking tricks up its sleeve with the release of Ninja Gaiden. Up to this point in gaming history, most action platformers on home consoles had very loose, bare-bones narratives. You were simply a hero going from point A to point B to rescue someone. Ninja Gaiden, however, completely revolutionized how stories were told in video games by introducing what Tecmo called the Tecmo Theater system. Between its fast-paced action stages, the game featured stunning, anime-style cinematic cutscenes, complete with dynamic camera angles, dramatic pacing, and text dialogue. It gave protagonist Ryu Hayabusa a deeply personal revenge narrative that actually made players care about the context of the action taking place on screen. On the gameplay front, Ninja Gaiden was equally legendary, characterized by its incredibly tight controls, lightning-fast pacing, and its notoriously brutal, unforgiving difficulty. It introduced the ability to cling to and jump off walls, giving players a level of vertical agility that felt entirely new for the era. While the relentless enemy respawns, especially those infamous run-ending eagles that knocked you into bottomless pits, caused endless frustration, the flawless blend of cinematic storytelling and hardcore action made Ninja Gaiden an absolute masterpiece of 1988.
While technically launching in Japan at the very tail end of 1987, Phantasy Star hit Western shores in 1988 and completely redefined what a console role-playing game could be. At a time when RPGs were strictly medieval affairs, filled with swords and sorcery, Sega delivered a sprawling, vibrant sci-fi fantasy epic set across 3 distinct planets in the Algol star system. The game was a technical marvel for the 8-bit Sega Master System, housed in a massive 4-megabit cartridge, one of the largest of its era. This extra storage allowed for mind-blowing visuals, most notably the incredibly smooth, fast-scrolling first-person 3D dungeons that left NES owners absolutely speechless. Beyond its technical achievements, Phantasy Star was groundbreaking for its narrative. It featured a strong female protagonist, Alice Landale, embarking on a deeply personal, story-driven quest to avenge her murdered brother and overthrow a galactic tyrant. With its battery-backed save system, gorgeous anime-style enemy sprites, and a beautifully composed soundtrack by Tokuhiko Uwabo, Phantasy Star didn't just compete with its 8-bit RPG rivals. In many ways, it completely surpassed them, laying the groundwork for one of Sega's most beloved and enduring franchises. Following the explosive success of the original Contra in 1987, Konami unleashed Super Contra into arcades in early 1988, proving that the run-and-gun genre was here to stay. Taking control of the iconic muscle-bound commandos Bill Riser and Lance Bean once again, players were thrown back into a brutal, high-stakes war against the alien Red Falcon organization. While the core, frantic, side-scrolling gameplay remained beautifully intact, Konami made several key changes to elevate the experience. Most notably, they completely ditched the pseudo-3D into-the-screen base segments from the first game. In their place, Super Contra introduced intense, top-down vertical scrolling stages that allowed for 8-way firing and demanded a completely different set of dodging skills from the player. The game also ramped up the visual fidelity, introducing larger, more grotesque alien boss designs that pushed arcade hardware to new heights. Weapons were tweaked, allowing players to upgrade their firepower, like the legendary spread gun, by picking up the same power-up twice. With a steeper, unforgiving difficulty curve and a blistering, adrenaline-pumping soundtrack, the 1988 arcade release of Super Contra solidified the franchise's reputation as the undisputed king of cooperative arcade shooters. Released by Capcom into arcades in December 1988, Ghouls and Ghosts is an absolute masterclass in challenging game design and technological advancement. As the highly anticipated sequel to the 1985 hit Ghosts and Goblins, this game marked one of the earliest high-profile uses of Capcom's legendary CP System 1 arcade board. This hardware leap resulted in a staggering upgrade in graphical fidelity, treating players to breathtakingly detailed sprites, macabre, multi-scrolling atmospheric backgrounds, and a hauntingly beautiful synth-heavy soundtrack. Returning hero Arthur the Knight was given crucial new abilities to survive the nightmare. For the first time, players could shoot directly upward as well as downward while jumping, adding a massive layer of vertical strategy to the combat. The game also introduced the Golden Armor, a spectacular upgrade that allowed Arthur to charge up devastating, screen-clearing magic attacks that varied depending on which weapon he was holding. However, all these upgrades were strictly necessary because Ghouls and Ghosts retained the franchise's soul-crushing, legendary difficulty. True to the sadistic vision of director Tokuro Fujiwara, players who miraculously managed to beat the game were stripped of their victory and forced to play through the entire grueling campaign a second time just to see the true ending and fight the real final boss. In the annals of video game history, the story behind Super Mario Bros. 2 is one of the most fascinating. Released in North America in October 1988, this game was actually fundamentally different from the grueling, ultra-difficult sequel Japan received 2 years prior, later known to the West as The Lost Levels. Deeming the Japanese sequel too punishing for Western audiences, Nintendo famously took a completely unrelated Famicom Disk System game called Yume Kojo Doki Doki Panic, swapped in Mario characters, tweaked the mechanics, and released it to the world as Super Mario Bros. 2. Because of this bizarre origin, the game introduced wildly different mechanics to the Mario universe. Instead of jumping on enemies to defeat them, players had to pluck vegetables from the ground or pick up the enemies themselves to hurl them across the screen. It also gave players the unprecedented choice of 4 distinct playable characters: Mario, Luigi, Toad, and Princess Toadstool, each boasting unique physics like Luigi's signature flutter jump and the princess's invaluable hovering ability. Despite its imposter status, this 1988 release was an incredible commercial success that permanently injected iconic staples into the franchise, including Birdo, Shy Guys, Bob-ombs, and the concept of a health meter. While North America was plucking turnips in Super Mario Bros. 2, Japan was experiencing a legitimate paradigm shift with the release of Super Mario Bros. 3 in October 1988. Directed by Takashi Tezuka and Shigeru Miyamoto, this title didn't just push the 8-bit Famicom (NES) to its absolute technical limits, it completely rewrote the rulebook for 2D platformers. The sheer volume of innovation packed into this cartridge is staggering. It introduced the concept of the interactive world map, allowing players to choose different paths, skip levels, and engage with wandering enemies or toad houses. It also implemented an inventory system where players could store power-ups for later use. Speaking of power-ups, Super Mario Bros. 3 delivered a legendary arsenal, most notably the Super Leaf, which gave Mario a raccoon tail and the unprecedented ability to take flight, blowing the level design wide open with vertical exploration. It also debuted the Frog Suit, the Tanuki Suit, and the Koopalings, who acted as the memorable bosses of each world's airship. With its tight physics, brilliantly diverse stage themes, and peerless pacing, this 1988 Japanese release is widely regarded not just as one of the best games on the NES, but as one of the greatest video games of all time. If there is one game that defines the sheer cultural impact of video games in 1988, it is undoubtedly Dragon Quest III, initially released in North America years later as Dragon Warrior 3. When Enix launched this monumental RPG in Japan in February 1988, it triggered an actual nationwide phenomenon. The hype was so astronomical that massive lines wrapped around city blocks and widespread truancy from students and absenteeism from workers famously forced the Japanese government to urge Enix to only release future Dragon Quest games on weekends. From a gameplay perspective, the hysteria was entirely justified. Yuji Horí's masterpiece perfected the traditional JRPG formula. Its crowning achievement was a deeply customizable class and job system. Instead of being handed a set cast of characters with predetermined roles, players went to the tavern in the starting town of Aliahan and custom-built their own party of mages, clerics, martial artists, and merchants. Furthermore, Dragon Quest III introduced a dynamic day and night cycle that actively changed town environments, NPC locations, and monster encounters. By combining Akira Toriyama's iconic character designs, Koichi Sugiyama's sweeping symphonic score, and a massive globe-trotting world map, Dragon Quest III didn't just top the 1988 sales charts, it solidified the RPG genre as an unstoppable mainstream force in the gaming industry.
In 1988, Richard Garriott pushed the boundaries of computer role-playing games to unprecedented new heights with the release of Ultima 5: Warriors of Destiny. Following the establishment of the noble 8 virtues in the previous game, Ultima 5 took a brilliantly dark and mature narrative turn. The beloved Lord British has gone missing in the underworld, leaving the realm of Britannia under the tyrannical rule of Lord Blackthorn. Corrupted by the sinister Shadow Lords, Blackthorn twists the virtues into a set of draconian authoritarian laws where minor infractions are punished by death. This forced players into an incredibly nuanced moral gray area. Instead of being a celebrated hero, the avatar becomes an outlaw fighting against a corrupted system. From a technical standpoint, Ultima 5 was an absolute marvel. It introduced a highly sophisticated day and night cycle that radically altered the gameplay. For the very first time in the series, non-player characters had their own daily schedules. They would wake up, go to work, eat, and sleep at specific times. You could even interact with the environment in unprecedented ways, like playing a harpsichord or pushing grandfather clocks. With its staggeringly detailed world, deep tactical combat, and mature storytelling, Ultima 5 set a new gold standard for the PC RPG genre in 1988. While the original Wonder Boy was a straightforward, relentlessly fast-paced arcade platformer, its sequel, Wonder Boy in Monsterland, underwent a massive metamorphosis. Although it initially hit Japanese arcades in late 1987, its incredibly popular and highly influential port for the Sega Master System arrived in 1988, completely changing the landscape for Sega's 8-bit console. Developed by Weststone, the game took the bold step of blending traditional side-scrolling platforming with deep role-playing game mechanics, creating an early, vital blueprint for the action RPG genre. As the hero Bok Lee, players were no longer just running to the right and throwing stone axes. Instead, defeated enemies dropped gold coins that could be spent in various shops scattered throughout the levels. Players had to carefully manage their economy to purchase upgraded swords, stronger armor, better shields, and magical spells. You could even interact with NPCs, like the memorable tavern-keeping pigs who provided vital hints and clues. The game also featured a hidden timer mechanism, where taking too long in a level would slowly drain your health, keeping the arcade-style tension alive. By successfully marrying the immediate thrill of an action game with the satisfying progression of an RPG, Wonder Boy in Monsterland became a definitive, must-play title in 1988. Long before the Fallout franchise popularized the post-apocalyptic RPG, a massive, irradiated foundation was laid in 1988 with the release of Wasteland. Developed by Interplay Productions and designed by a team that included Brian Fargo and Michael Stackpole, Wasteland traded the tired tropes of medieval fantasy for the scorched, mutant-infested deserts of a post-nuclear World War III survival scenario. You took command of a party of desert rangers, remnants of the U.S. Army, tasked with investigating disturbances across a desolate, unforgiving landscape. What made Wasteland a true revelation in 1988 was its incredibly deep pen-and-paper-inspired skill system. Instead of simply attacking or casting spells, characters had specific, highly specialized skills like lockpicking, metallurgy, cryptology, and even toaster repair. The game was designed to allow multiple solutions to a single problem based entirely on your party's unique skill makeup. Furthermore, Wasteland featured a persistent world, which was a staggering technical achievement at the time. If you blew up a door, killed an NPC, or fundamentally altered a town, the game saved those changes directly to the floppy disk. That door stayed destroyed for the rest of your playthrough. With its gritty writing, deeply reactive world, and innovative mechanics, Wasteland didn't just stand out in 1988, it essentially birthed the modern post-apocalyptic video game genre.